Greetings, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Higher Ed Geek Podcast, episode number 118, with Carlo Salerno, VP for Research at CampusLogic. So this is a really amazing episode. We talk about the work that CampusLogic does, but get right into the big topics when it comes to college student financing, debt forgiveness, free college, all that good stuff. Really appreciate just the amount of knowledge that Carlo is bringing to this conversation and his thoughtfulness and really getting into the nuances of it all. It's a very complex issue, and it's really going to require some complex solutions. So it is just a really relevant and timely conversation as those sort of issues are grabbing headlines and just kind of thinking about the future of how students will finance their education, how we can try to simplify things and just make, everything work better for everybody. So really appreciate Carlo's time here. Go connect with him to keep the conversation going. Another quick note, there's an awesome sale going on right now at the merch store. Find that in the description of this episode. Also check out our Patreon if you want another way to support the show. But without further ado, this is episode number 118 with Carlo Salerno. Well, I'm excited because now this season, I think this is our second episode kind of focusing on student finances. Obviously, it's a topic that absolutely warrants further discussion. I'm really excited to just dig in deeper with it. But Carlo, we'll start out as we always do. If you want to introduce yourself and give an overview of your professional journey and how you got to be where you are today.
My name is Carlo Salerno, and I am the Vice President of Research at CampusLogic. I'm an education economist. I have been PhD trained and have been working in the space for about 22 or 23 years now. So I spent a little bit of time working for the federal government at the Government Accountability Office, doing higher education research for the Congress. In a past life, I also had my own education analytics startup company, and I spent some time also in the entrepreneurial space working on income share agreements and also working with a number of industry groups, whether they be student loan providers or institutions themselves. Also done a lot of policy work and sort of contracted analysis for advocacy groups, financial aid organizations, anything that really promotes student financial success, financial aid access, those challenges around, why people struggle to get into college, get through college, get out of college, and how to pay for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I know just with that background, like you just are very immersed and knowledgeable about all this. I'm very excited to just kind of dig in deeper here with you. So just to kind of get the context for where you are now, if you want to really quick, just explain a bit about what CampusLogic does, and then we'll kind of go in with just sort of the broader topic of, college student finances.
Sure. So CampusLogic is a software company. It's based in Chandler, Arizona, which is in the Phoenix suburbs. Basically what CampusLogic does is it provides a lot of back-end, underlying support to help smooth the financial aid experience, as I like to think about it. We're not a consumer-facing organization. We help financial aid offices in particular sort of manage and process the flow of financial aid. We help things like we provide access to net price calculators. We have a scholarship engine. We help schools process things like verifications. We do a lot of that back end work that, again, like I said, like helps keep the focus on learning for students rather than getting financial aid. So we smooth things. So and we have a wide array of services, and probably work with, I'm going to say, at least in excess of 600 college campuses today.
Awesome. Yeah, it's great to hear just the focus and just sort of that outcome. Like you said, that students are able to focus more on their studies, because I think anybody working in higher ed probably knows for students that that's always something that's kind of hanging over their heads one way or another is, finances of either, like funding their degree or just certainly any of the other number of expenses that students will have and
right.
Working and balancing everything. So, certainly, again, it is really just like a big topic of conversation. I think there's a lot of nuances, and we'll try to hit on as much as we can there and the different aspects of college student financing. But just we'll start really broadly and start to zoom in. But like, what is your take kind of on the overall landscape for students right now in terms of like what you said of like getting in, staying in, and eventually graduating when it comes to students figuring out financial aid and all those different pieces?
Good question. I mean, I think it's hard. I think for the typical family today, uh, figuring out how to pick the right college, figuring out what they can afford, figuring out how to navigate the entire financial aid experience itself, and sort of manage that amidst the academics and basically all the other life experiences that people have that go around the college. I think it's hard. I think getting I think immersing the college experience into someone's life today is challenging and it's difficult. And while we try to provide students with lots of resources to help smooth those things, we being sort of just the larger higher education industry, I think sometimes we probably get underneath our own feet and end up maybe tripping people up rather than helping them. And I think for the moment, as if you walk through the experience and you think about the shopping phase, there's lots of different resources that people can use. They have different levels of trust attached to them, and you have a financial aid experience which has lots of resources available, whether they be grants or scholarships or loans or work study. But finding out about those things and understanding the pros and cons of different options and trying to sort of piece all of those together into something that becomes a financing plan is probably a lot harder to do in practice than it looks on paper. And so I think at the moment, most people feel like, we people are still of the mindset that they need to go to college and that a college education has some intrinsic value, and it does. Economists will tell you that it's a really good bet, on average, right? And so I think, while folks believe that they need a college education, I think there's an increasing level of frustration as prices go up and the complexity of figuring out how to pay for college gets worse, not better. There's a lot of folks who have a lot of frustration about paying for college, and that cascades into other problems, most notably completion, right? It's hard to it's hard to focus on completing your college degree when you're struggling year in and year out to figure out how to pay for it.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, just the words that you were using, like hard, complex, frustrating, all that, like that is really just, just emphasize those because, yeah, I mean that is how I would describe kind of the current state of affairs right now, and I think it's even just the idea with like the complexity or just like the sometimes lack of guidance. Like I'll have students sometimes that I've worked with where like they get like tripped up like you said, and like they filled out the wrong FAFSA, and that negatively impacts their ability to persist, or like start the program. They have to like defer, or they like
Right.
like just got confused and did something wrong, and that just one little grain of sand kind of threw off the whole system for them. So it's like for all intents and purposes, like, oh, just fill out the other form. But like, the timing of which they do that and the timeliness of them, like knowing that they have the aid that they need to be able to move forward and everything. It's just like, yeah, I mean, that's kind of where things are. And just, it's a shame that obviously like, that's how it is. And I mean, I'm thankful, there's folks like you and CampusLogic, trying to support that. But like, and it's also like reassuring that I think it is now, I think, just very painfully aware to the powers that be that is how things are. And I think some folks earnestly trying to make things like the FAFSA a little bit
That's
more
right.
simple. So
That's right.
but I guess that we'll spend a little time on that. I mean, that's really like the really a bit of the crux of it, of like seeing that connection between students being able to navigate these systems to fund their degrees and their enrollment and their success and eventual graduation, stuff like that. So I guess just take that as you will. Like, what do you see as the connection between those things, just to really put like a finer, bolder point on this? Like, yeah, I don't know, like any anecdotes or stories or just things that you've seen in your work that
Yeah.
really kind of make that clear.
Well, I mean, again, right? Like we can't have paying for college getting in the way of getting something out of college, right? And like a good way to think about it, right, is to sort of think about, you know, there are other things in life that we buy where we have to debt finance them and we have to invest a lot of money, right? Like most people who buy a new car, right? The typical new car probably comes in at around $28,000 to $32,000, I think, in financing, right? For for some folks, right? That's pretty much in line with what the average student leaves with a bachelor's degree in federal student loan debt. Like we borrow for homes, which there we're taking on hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And we do it with loans, and we actually do it
Mm.
really easily, right? There are apps, right? The experience is very seamless. It's very user friendly. You can provide your information. You can do it at the touch of the touch of your phone. Or if you go to a car dealership, for example, right? Like car dealers have gotten really good at, helping you not only figure out, what you can afford and how much debt you can take on, but doing the due diligence of like getting the paperwork managed and checking all the boxes and getting you into a car within like 3 or 4 hours, right? And then contrast that with like buying college today. Like you said, right? I have to fill out a FAFSA. And then after I fill out a FAFSA, I have to wait weeks and I'm going to get some kind of form back from the government telling me what I may or may not be eligible for. And I may use a net price calculator while I'm shopping that'll sort of give me a sense of how much an education will cost, but I won't really know until they accept me. And then they accept me, and then they're going to send me a financial aid award, and I have to pick and choose amongst the different options there. And amidst all of this, maybe I'm also simultaneously applying for state grants, or maybe I'm also applying for private scholarships. And so some of those may hit, some of those may not. I may not find out till June, July, or August that I got a scholarship or I got a state grant. And then when I think, oh, great, I did get one of these things and it's going to make paying for college a little easier, I may then find out afterwards that, oh, hey, by getting this grant, somebody else reduced my award someplace else, right? Because I had apparently a last dollar scholarship.
Mm.
And then amidst all this, there's verification challenges and there's getting your money and processing your paperwork. And all of that happens just in the course of one academic year. And then I have to redo this process every single year. And if I'm a bachelor's degree student, right, that could be 5 or 6 iterations potentially of this. If I go to graduate school, I could have to do this 8 or 9 years, this process of completing forms, guessing how much it's going to cost, applying for different sources of aid, finding out at different times when they're going to hit or not. That's an awful lot of uncertainty for something that, again, in other markets where we take on 20, 30, 50, 100, $200,000 worth of debt, we're able to button all that down in hours, and people can walk away with an asset and they can walk away with a financing option that's clear and transparent. And college just feels anything but. And so that's the complexity that we see when we talk about student financial success, and college, paying for college getting in the way of getting something out of college, when every single year you have to sort of navigate this minefield of the financing process. Like even the savviest consumer is going to trip up, right? They're going to miss a deadline, they're going to slip on something, they're going to make a mistake in paperwork that could delay things sometimes weeks or months. And so we can't have the financing system defeat the purpose of why you're financing it to begin with. Does that make any sense?
Absolutely does. I mean, you talking about just all this stuff too. I'm just like, wow, I am grateful I've not had to fill out the FAFSA for, I guess, gosh, like, I mean, 6 years now, I think, or 7 years.
Right.
Cause yeah, I mean, like, it's just is like, yeah, the idea of the frequency of it. And also that like the onus is entirely on the individual student to navigate these complex systems. And yeah, all it takes is one sort of even, yeah, just fumble. And the timeliness is what I kept thinking of, where it's like, yeah, you do everything right. And sometimes like beyond your control, there's a delay in things processing. And if you really need that financial support, especially if you're, depending on it to buy textbooks or other school supplies, then I've even seen that where it's like, it's just a matter of time, like it
Right.
just, that gets in the way and a student changes their plans because of that. But I guess something else I'm curious about with this is, sometimes it is just navigating these systems, but I'm curious how much, because I think it may be, more or less, I guess, relevant here, but I'm just curious your thoughts. But like, where a student chooses to study, how much that institution costs, and what program of study that they are pursuing, like, because it could be like, depending on like, oh, you're choosing to go here, it's, more expensive, and you're studying this, which is the sort of like earnings potential and those sort of things. Like, do you see that kind of factoring in at all in terms of just like, yeah, I don't know, obviously, the idea of like taking
Yeah.
on debt for something and like the kind of return on that investment.
So it's a good question, and I think it's actually an important explainer to why people sometimes make the borrowing choices that they do when they're
Hmm.
in college or thinking about college, right? Like, I don't think anybody goes to school thinking they're going to fail, right? Nobody thinks I'm going to enroll in college and most likely drop out. Nobody thinks that. Nobody
Hmm.
thinks that if they're going to go to school for engineering, they're not going to come out with an engineering degree. And anybody who thinks they're going to get an engineering degree doesn't think they're going to wait 6 months to a year to get a job after they graduate. They think they're going to get a job right away. And they think they're probably going to get well paid for it because they think they care about this and they love it and they think they're good at it, right? People don't bet against themselves. We're not designed to bet against ourselves. We're not designed to take the default position that we're going to fail. And that's important because if I'm in college and I'm a freshman or a sophomore, or maybe I'm just 18 or 19 years old and just transitioning from high school, right? Like, imagine for a second that I have this sense that I think, oh, well, engineers make $120,000 a year. And oh, wow, like if I'm going to make $120,000 a year, maybe I can afford to borrow a little more right now because I'm going to earn all of this money. And maybe those engineers will make 120,000 eventually, but chances are when I leave school, I'm not going to make 120,000. I'm only going to make maybe 50,000 in my first job. Eventually, I may creep up to that, but that also means that I have to graduate, and we know that almost half of students these days struggle to even graduate. We know that the typical timeline for getting a job can sometimes be months rather than weeks, which is why, like, the federal government gives us 6 months before we have to start repaying on our student loans. And so the point of all this is that if I have unreal expectations about the future, or if I have expectations about the future that don't line up with sort of the job market or the wage structure of an industry, like, I can borrow in ways that could end up hurting me later on down the road. Right? Does that make sense? Like,
Hmm.
if I think I'm going to go into engineering and I think there's a big pot of money at the end of the road, I may choose to borrow more. If I think I'm going to go into communications or marketing, or maybe I think I'm going to go into English, right? Each one of those career trajectories behind those majors come with expectations about what we can do with that. And so if I think the job market's going to be great, I think the earnings are going to be great, I may choose to double down on my borrowing while I'm in school, thinking there's going to be some pot of gold later. And again, most of the math tells us, right, that like getting to that pot at the end of the rainbow is feasible and possible. It just typically takes longer um, than most of us think it's going to take.
Yeah. Well, I know too, I think that plays in a lot with like law school or medical school, like,
Yeah,
the amount of debt that people will take on
that's
with
right.
that expectation. And it's just like you said, it's not guaranteed. And, if it does happen, it could take a while to happen in the way that you think it's going to. So,
Right.
because I think that segues, a little bit more sort of like, you know, as like a, economist, with that background that you have, like there's sort of economic policies that are, I think, working to try to address these issues. It's sort of like on both ends of sort of the cycle of like, because you have sort of the quote unquote just like free college sort of movement, or a lot of discussions about debt forgiveness, which obviously are impactful for people either, on the front end or the back end of their higher education journeys and stuff. So, there's just really big forces at play here. But I'm sure, again, it's one of those things that I just feel like I've been saying a lot lately. It's just like, things are not as simple as they might appear on their face. Like there's just a lot of nuance. So what do you think are kind of the most important things for people to know about these two policies? Because the ones that are just definitely have a lot of sizzle to them, but I'm sure you maybe have
Right.
some nuance to add to both of them.
Yeah, it's a good question. Let's start with free college, right? Like, I think, I think if there was something that I would hope people would walk away uh, when they hear about free college, is the recognition that, in fact, nothing is free, right? Free in this respect just simply means someone else is paying for it, right? We want college to be free for a certain class of people that we think would benefit the most from higher education, but somebody still has to pay for that. right? At the end of the day. And so if the student doesn't end up paying for that, the question then becomes, well, who could pay for that and who should pay for that, right? Who could pay for that could be anything from taxpayers to, scholarship funds to endowments, all kinds of clever resources, right? There's a lot of different ways to help pay for free college. Um, I don't think we have a good handle yet on who would do that. One of the big challenges with free college, right, is that typically when we think about this discussion, it's a public sector discussion. We think about free college being something for public higher education. So, we talk a lot about community college, making community college free, for example, or in some cases talking about making four-year schools free, but we're talking about four-year public colleges. So, about a third of students don't go to public colleges, right? Like that's almost a third of students go to private nonprofit colleges, right? And so, what about them, right? Is one of those questions. If I academically am able to get into a really good private university, should I not be entitled to free college as much as the person who goes to the local community college? There's a lot of questions around um, who we're making it free for, but like who should we make it free for? So I think the debate when it comes to free is very nuanced, right? We want to help people who clearly would benefit the most from getting a college education. We want college to be a mobility, move you up the mobility ladder. Um, the question is always one of, there's only a limited pile of money to make that happen. And so who we should be helping, how we should be helping, that's where all the discussion is. And those aren't easy things to answer. While free college feels good as a slogan, when you really dig down into it, when you only have a scarce pool of resources and you're trying to figure out who should get the free college and how it should be done, it becomes a really hard discussion to have. And that's where I think policymakers and researchers and pundits really get bogged down.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I want to talk about debt forgiveness, right? Like debt forgiveness is a different order challenge, right? Because now we're not talking about helping somebody get into college, we're helping somebody who's already gone through college, right? And so the question then with debt forgiveness is like, is it a good idea? Would it help some of those who need it? Sure. Would it help some who don't need it? Sure, right? Like, what happens if we give somebody debt forgiveness but still leave the borrowing spigot open, right? Like, just because we make a point in time decision to forgive debt doesn't mean that everybody who enrolls in college tomorrow isn't going to still be taking on and accumulating more debt to begin with. And so I think one of the biggest challenges with debt forgiveness is that it solves it solves the problem of like imagine pouring a bucket of paint on the floor, right? Like debt forgiveness would be the equivalent of like mopping the paint up without thinking about the fact that like maybe another bucket is already pouring out to begin with afterwards, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like you mopped the floor, but you didn't stop the spill from continuing to happen. So did you fix something or did you just prolong something? And so, again, while debt forgiveness feels good, there's a lot of nuanced challenges to it. There's a reason why we debate these things. There's a reason why we haven't been able to sort of settle on whether debt forgiveness is in fact a good idea. And let's also not forget, right? That like, folks who go to college to begin with enjoy an economic advantage. They earn more money. They typically get jobs that are more stable, more white collar, more room to grow into. And not everybody also goes to college either. So if we're going to give debt forgiveness, we're forgiving the debt of people who already have an economic advantage in the labor market, and we're also giving an economic advantage to only a fraction of the population because the fact is a lot of people still don't go to college, right? And so when we think about debt forgiveness as a way to sort of help American families, there's a lot of families out there who never went to college. And the question is, well, don't they deserve some kind of economic relief as well? Why would we choose to focus on giving relief to people who, by virtue of having college degrees or some college training, already have sort of a leg up in the job market space? So, in both of
Yeah.
these cases, there's no easy they feel like cut and dry topics if you really just surface brush them. But if you take the time to sort of think about some of the challenges, there's some really good arguments for and against both free college and debt forgiveness, that really show that there's no clear cut answer. If there was a clear cut answer, we probably would already have policy based on
Hmm. Yeah. Well, it makes me think of a lot of the debate around like, uh, as of the recording of this, there's a forthcoming probably another relief bill due to like the pandemic and everything, and there's always just like who deserves to get like stimulus money and who deserves not to, and those sort of
it.
things. Like, there's the idea of like the idea of fairness has many interpretations. Like it can be fair that like everybody gets it. That's fair, right? It's like it is, but there's some people that get it that don't really need it,
Correct.
and those sort of things. So it's just like you do have to kind of settle on your idea of fairness, and then because I think with what you're saying too, it's the idea that like, well, with budgets what they are for like states and like federal government and all that, it's like you'd have to like raise taxes if you're really going to like, especially like open up
Yeah,
everything wide open. And that often is like, very harmful politically for a lot of people to say like, oh, we're raising taxes on everybody,
that's
or
right.
even to select people, it's like on principle, people like push back on that.
That's right. There really is, like, for every, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction, right? You can't just you can't grow money out of nothing, right? You typically, money for something means money not going to something else, and public dollars being what they are, right? We would love to invest in education. We would love to invest in helping people's futures, but at the same time, there's a lot of other public issues, whether that be roads, whether it be childcare, whether it be healthcare, right, that also want a piece of the public dollar pie. And so, taxpayer dollars feel really large until you think about all the things that they're meant to fund. And then you realize at the end of the day that, like, in fact, the amount of money that we can spend on higher education never is enough for what we really wish we could spend on it, which is why Pell hasn't ever really grown. I mean, people have been talking about, doubling the Pell Grant for, I don't know, 20 years now at least, right? There's a reason why we haven't been able to boost Pell funding, and it's not for want. It's just simply, where do the dollars come from to make that happen? So,
Yeah. Well, because that's the idea. Like, it's like, okay, well, we're not going to raise taxes. Like, we all agree on that. So, like, so then what are we going to cut? It's like, and everybody's still just kind of like wringing their hands, like, ooh, I don't know, I don't want to cut anything because that's also like harmful politically. So you're kind
and
of
that's
like in a
and that's
stalemate.
one of the challenges with, like, I think when you see proposals for free college or loan forgiveness that sort of do things like say, well, we'll pay for it with an ultra wealth tax, for example. It's like, sure, that's great. We could pay for that with an ultra wealth tax, but if you were to successfully implement an ultra wealth tax, don't think for a second that, if you suddenly have a new pot of money that, like, policymakers are going to think, oh, well, let's spend that on giving, kids free access to community college, right? Like, an ultra wealth tax will have legislators lining up outside the door to say, hey, I've got bridges and roads that are crumbling and falling apart. And, we'd love to have, a better healthcare system. Like, I don't think it's as simple when you see a lot of these proposals who just simply say, we're going to tax the wealthy more. Sure, like, that's a way to pay for it, but I think even if you're able to build a new pot of dollars like that, I don't think we should be fooled into thinking that, like, there aren't a lot of other public projects when you stand them up against, if I said, hey, Dustin, would you rather have free community college or better healthcare? What would you choose, right? Like, I think a lot of people care about their health. And other people might say, you know what, community college isn't expensive to begin with, and it doesn't benefit everybody. And so maybe we want to spend that on health instead. And those are the kinds of dilemmas that I think policymakers face, but also, again, researchers and pundits face as they sort of think about the trade offs for these big ticket policy proposals.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's a tough one because I think the thing that I think of, I just wanted to mention quickly with like, free college that I've heard often is like, well, sure, you allow somebody to get in, without having to kind of front any payment for tuition and those sort of things. But there's still expenses in terms of like, well, where are you going to live? You need school supplies, textbooks, like, so it's like room and board and, all these other kind of things. And, so thankfully some institutions do have like, like emergency aid, like, kind of just supplemental assistance that they can give to students. But, it's just not scalable in the way that would maybe have the full impact. And it would be the idea that, yeah, like people who have the means are like, cool, great, I get, tuition paid for, and they'll enroll and those sort of things. So it just like, I'm optimistic and hopeful because I believe in these kind of policies because they feel
Sure.
very like, like you said, they just feel good. But yeah, I mean, it's that idea of like that we've just been kind of going back and forth on them for some time. So
But
I'd
they
love to see if
feel,
they can. Yeah.
yeah, but they feel good and they should feel good because there are people who could benefit from both, right? There are people who most definitely could benefit from having access to free college, and there are people who could most definitely benefit from having student loan debt forgiveness, right? Like, I think again, like the challenge is not that we as a society don't want to give these things out. It's just when you're faced with scarce resources, like you really have to draw some really tough lines as to who gets it and who doesn't, because unfortunately the pool just isn't big enough to give everybody everything. And that's typically with most social policy the challenge, right? We just, if we can't do it for everybody, we have to design some kind of rules or heuristics for figuring out who should get it and who shouldn't. And that's most of the social outrage that you read in social media today, right? It's somebody taking a position on who's more deserving or less deserving. So
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely right. Well, then, with all that being said, I mean, looking towards the future, like, what are you keeping an eye on when it comes to this topic in terms of, yeah, like these potential policies, what you think might be more or less likely, or just like, I don't know, like where's the wind blowing, I guess, from your perspective?
yeah. So I think when we talk about looking ahead for higher education, right? Like college costs are what they are, right? If there was a way to make the price of college substantively cheaper for families, right? There's more than 5,000 colleges in this country. If there was a way to truly slash the price of college, at least one school would have found a sustainable way of doing that, right? Just for a competitive advantage standpoint. So I think we should accept the fact that, right, like college tuition is what it is, right? It's probably going to still creep up. Schools will still face pressure to sort of justify the costs that they or the prices that they charge. So I think what we're probably bound to see going forward are two things. I think we're going to see more students and families pushing for things like upfront all-in pricing. Like I said before, this idea of like having to pay for college every single year and go through this guessing game of how much I'm going to need, how much I'm going to finance, oh, I missed a deadline this year, so I don't get my state grant, which means suddenly this year I have to get a loan, right? Like all of those things are challenges and headaches. And I think one way for schools from an enrollment standpoint to recruit more and better students is to be more transparent, to give people more fixed upfront pricing so that they can budget for it, right? Like, don't tell me it's going to cost me $500 a credit hour. Tell me if I want to get a bachelor's degree that it's going to cost me $36,200, right? And now I know this is how much it's going to cost me no matter what I do, and I'm going to go figure out a way to pay for it, right? The same way we don't tell people, hey, if you want to buy this car, you have to, we're going to charge you $6, or we're going to charge you 50 cents a mile, and then we're going to make you finance it every year based on that. We tell people this is the all-in price for the car and you can finance it. I think that's one thing that's going to change over time because I think the confusion doesn't serve institutions and the confusion definitely doesn't serve students. So I think what we're bound to see is a way of paying for college that eventually will just become simpler. It needs to become simpler because people are having harder and harder times trying to figure out what they're buying, what they're paying for, and how to finance it. And so we're going to hit a breaking point sooner rather than later. I think the second thing that we're going to see, and I think we're going to see this even sooner, is I think if I'm a college or a university and I want to demonstrate that I'm affordable or a better bargain, I think one of the things that we're probably going to see is schools increasingly focusing on how much it costs in tuition to go to a school versus how much the cost of attendance is, and including all of those things like living expenses and books and dining hall plans and allowances for transportation costs and the like, right? Like at the end of the day, it's a lot easier to say, hey, go to my school, and for $16,000 in tuition you can get a bachelor's degree, rather than say, hey, go to my school where the cost of attendance is $28,000 a year and spend $100,000 to get a bachelor's degree. So I think what we're more likely to see is institutions probably to start touting how much it costs to actually get training from their school, and then separating out like all of those sort of indirect ancillary things, right? I think it's just an easier way to help sell the case that some people don't want room and board, and some people don't need transportation costs. And to the extent that the pandemic has done anything, it's probably helped a lot of folks realize, what, I don't even need to be on campus, right? Like maybe virtual is more of an option than I ever thought it would be. And so I think what we're going to see is just more effort to focus selling higher education on the price of the services rather than this whole larger experience, because some people just want to buy an education, other people want to buy an education experience, and those are two different things, and the latter is a lot more expensive.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, because I think we've seen too, just this past year has been very like intriguing to me, because I think it's shown people that things are possible that people thought maybe weren't, or would be too hard or something. But because I think you've seen a lot of institutions like roll back any like tuition increases that you might have had, or just manage price in a different way, because obviously it's always just constantly gone up. But yeah, just even that idea of like if you're kind of like buying into like a package of like, hey, we'll guarantee a tuition rate at the rate of which when you started, like it's not going to increase year over year. And I think just seeing institutions play around with that, and because like in my experience, I think in some of the smaller like credentials like certificates and stuff, like they'll say like, yeah, if you want to get this certificate, it's like this much money for the whole thing, and it just shows that it's like this much per course or something like it. And there's that idea where it's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's the price for the whole thing, great. And they have a certain level of like maybe certainty or control over like that pricing and stuff. But yeah, I mean, it just seems like a big undercurrent is just like simplifying things. Like it has just become so complex. It'd be refreshing just to have a little bit more simplicity here for sure.
If you think about just how as consumers we've become, right? Like if there's one thing technology has done for us, it's um, it's created um, it's created an environment where consumers have become accustomed to very simplified, streamlined experiences, right? Like we don't want to wait for an answer. We want to be able to open our phone, click a couple buttons, and get an answer. And we want that to happen on a Tuesday at 2 p.m., and we want that to happen on a Saturday at 1 a.m., right? And so experiences that are burdensome and complicated and wear us down, we're really quick to jettison, I think, today in a way that we never were before, because in too many cases, like there's probably some better option out there that's going to be more streamlined and easier to use. And we see that in the school case, right? Like we see there are colleges that do a really good job of being super responsive to their students' needs, right? And being hyper responsive to helping people figure out how to pay for college, get in the door, get their courses scheduled. They get it. Like they get that, in the same way that a car dealer will, almost never wants somebody to go home, right? Like no car salesman wants to spend 2 hours with somebody and then have that person say, well, I'm going to go home and go get some information, because they know that the moment you think about it and that it drags out, there's reasons you won't come back. Schools understand that as well. Schools understand that if you make the experience seamless and easy, and you remove the obstacles, I can do what I said at the top of the hour here, which is, focus on the learning and not let the financing get in the way of the whole reason why I'm doing this to begin with.
Yeah. Yeah, it's almost that idea of like, don't let me overthink it. Like I clearly wanted to do this, however long ago, like you said with the car, it's like, don't let me, yeah, just sit and stew on it. But yeah, I mean, it's just really compelling, the idea of like, at the end of it, that is really just like the driving force that would hope people really take to heart is like, we want these people, these potential students who are earnestly, maybe, just trying to uplift their life and kind of live out that promise of higher education, uh, let's make that, let's remove as many points of friction that we can in that. It certainly is a big investment. It's very complex. There's a lot of moving pieces, but um, I think anymore, there's just so many opportunities because I think of, I guess like an interesting parallel because like I just did it recently of like when you file your taxes, which like that still also needs I think to be
Right.
simpler, but like there's certainly a now like competitive market incentive to like uh, make that super simple. Like there's a lot of platforms that you can choose from to
Exactly.
file your taxes and stuff. So like yeah, and I guess like, if people want to learn more, it's always nice to be able to share out resources. So I'm curious, anything that you would want to make sure to kind of give a tip of the hat to that we could share out in the show notes for this episode.
I mean, I think there's been a slate of books that have come out in the past year, including by Ron Lieber and Josh Mitchell, around student aid that are worth looking into. There's some great researchers out there like Robert Kelchin, for example, who's been very thoughtful about the policy issues around these things. Definitely worth following. I think again, there's people and there's ideas out there. It's really hard to pick, preferred resources at this point. But I would say that there's some good people out there studying some good things. And I think if you were to go into, for example, Twitter and keyword in higher ed, you're going to find half a dozen to a dozen thought leaders uh, who offer some really fair, balanced insights into these issues that will just make you a smarter person at the end of the day, whether you're a researcher or a pundit who cares about these issues, or you're just the casual observer who just wants to be more informed.
Yeah, great stuff. Yeah, just appreciate the name drops, and we'll link out to those folks for sure. So,
Yeah.
um, but yeah, as we always do, just kind of wrapping up the episode with any final thoughts, calls to action to end the episode on. So, kind of the floor is yours. However you want to take that to just wrap things up.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, again, thanks for having me. It's great to talk about these issues, and like we've sort of covered here, right? Like there's no set answers here. Like a lot of these things when it comes to education or debate, right? There's trade-offs, there's pros and cons. If there were clear-cut, answers, we probably would have adopted them or taken advantage of them. And the fact that these things aren't clear-cut means that even if you feel strongly about an issue, chances are there's some good reason why somebody else may feel otherwise. But I think if we're going to push forward, like the goal, the goal has to be to help people get educations, and people get education so that they could get employment. So, we need to help make students be better shoppers. We need to give them better information. We need to, again, help prevent the actual financing from getting way of the experience itself, right? Like the simpler we can make things, the easier we can make things, the easier it is on students who struggle to plan, right? We like predictability. We like to be able to plan and budget for things. And if we want to make that work for people, if we want people to be able to get college educations and not feel like they're drowning in debt, and we want to make people feel like they're getting a bargain, we have to help them figure out what it costs, and we have to help them figure out how to pay for it. And we have to do that in a very transparent way. And some of those things can be done from a policy perspective by, again, sort of creating ways to price college so that consumers understand it. Part of that is coming up with ways to create consumer tools to help people become better shoppers. And part of that is to help give schools the tools that they need to support students as they go through the process, because a lot of the times, even under the best circumstances, right, anything that takes years to do means that there's lots of other things that can interfere, between the start of the race and the end of the race. And like we have health issues, and we have employment issues, and we have children, and we have other things that happen in our lives. And so we need to be able to help people accommodate the life around their college experience. And not all that gets solved with financing. But again, to the extent that we can make financing easier, that's one less thing that people have to worry about. And if one less thing to worry about means one more person getting through the process, I think at the end of the day, everybody wins. So,
Absolutely. I think it's very well said. And I just appreciate how thoughtful you are about this, because I think what I'm sort of sitting with is that like this is a very complex issue that is going to require complex solutions. It's not just going to be like, oh, if we just do free college, that's the silver bullet. It's just going to solve all the problems, and like we can just sort of pat ourselves on the back and move on. It's like you said, it is as much about helping students finance as it is about helping students to succeed while they're in their studies, at college and all of that. So there's just a lot to consider here. I'm very happy that I feel like we've covered quite a bit, and just appreciate again your thoughtfulness and all that you shared, and just appreciate your time. So we'll have ways to connect with you and all that you talked about down the show notes as usual. But yeah, just thank you so much.
yeah, Dustin, thanks for having me again. I really enjoyed the time. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the podcast. Make sure to rate, review, and subscribe so you never miss an episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Higher Ed Geek podcast.